There are lots of different kinds of genetic tests that exist in the world. They kind of fall into two broad categories. So one we call it copy number testing. So that's where we're looking for large, extra, and missing pieces of chromosomes. So things that might be picked up by this kind of testing would be trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, or 22q deletion syndrome or DeGeorge syndrome. So these are extra and missing pieces of chromosomes. There's another type of testing that is sequencing based. So a sequencing based test reads through the genetic code at a much higher resolution. So rather than looking for extra and missing pieces of a chromosome, we're actually looking for any extra or missing letters in a gene, or any misspellings in that gene. As far as sequencing-based testing goes, there's a few ways to approach it. One is to test a single gene. That's not so common anymore unless the healthcare provider has a very good feeling about what the particular condition is. More often you'll see sequencing-based testing done as a panel. So a panel is where a person may have a particular health problem, such as seizures. And so with one test, we may analyze a couple hundred different genes that we know to be associated with seizures. And then there's also other kinds of sequencing-based testing, such as whole exome sequencing. So this is a test that's becoming quite commonplace in the field of genetics. So the exome is basically a fancy word for the part of the DNA that does a job for the body. So it is the gene that codes for a protein that does a job. And so what we do with the exome is we are reading through the entire coding portion of a person's genome and looking for any misspellings. So in this way, we're actually interrogating about 20,000 genes that could be associated with any number of health problems, as opposed to focusing more narrowly on one set of health problems. It's important to keep in mind, though, that the exome is actually only a very small part of our DNA, but it's still an enormous amount of data to go through. And so when we do an exome, we are focusing our analysis on the health problems that a person's having. But it is not capturing all of our genetic information. So the entirety of our genetic code is what we call the genome. And there are ways to do whole genome sequencing. And that is entering the clinical space now, but it's not something that's routinely offered and doesn't always have great utility. So the best thing is always to consult with a genetics provider about the best test for your child or for yourself based on the health problems that we're seeing, because we want to make sure that we're doing the test that's going to answer our question, not the test that's going to give us more questions. The advent of exome sequencing, it's sort of, as our genetics knowledge is increasing and our ability to detect genetic mutations is increasing, that's like when exome became a thing. And it's just a very broad test. So exome is best suited for individuals who have typically more than one health problem. So if you have only one health problem, a panel is usually the way to go. So if I use the example of seizures, if all a child has is seizures, focusing your analysis on seizures is probably the more useful approach. But if your child has seizures as well as a congenital heart defect, as well as developmental delay, now we're talking about, rather than doing 3 genetic tests, each that could take some amount of time or cost some amount of money, we could just do one test that would answer all of that. But you have to have an idea about what you're looking for in order for an exome to be helpful. Otherwise, it's quite literally like finding a needle in a haystack. If you were to do an exome on a healthy person, you may not find anything because you don't know the health problem that you're looking for, and you don't know where to focus your analysis among those 20,000 genes. It's an enormous amount of data. And so we have to have a very good reason to do that test. Otherwise, it's not going to be a fruitful endeavor.